Chapter 27. Red Seal Base, Antarctica. Clea had summoned the remaining 3 SEALs to the base over her computer's objections. The computer argued that it was a waste of resources. The I-950 countered that she had created those resources to be of help to her, and that she needed that help here and now. If the SEALs didn't make the trip, they didn't. But if they did, they might make the difference between Skynet's survival or John Connor's. She checked on the SEALs and found them exhausted, but closer than she'd dared to hope. Reluctantly, she decided to allow them a few hours of rest. After all, it would be better if they were capable of moving once they arrived. Her computer informed her that it was time to eat. Clea stood up impatiently and went to find something. If the damn thing wasn't satisfied that she was taking care of herself, it wouldn't leave her alone, flashing a continual reminder in the corner of her eye. Besides, Tricker was probably checking up on her, so she had to act like a human to satisfy him as well. As one of Skynet's most advanced weapons, she found the situation annoying. Mentally, she did a final rundown. No weapons on the base. Should she improvise explosives? No. Contraindicated. Ironically enough, she was better off making this a body-to-body confrontation. Anything she made, John Connor might be able to turn against her. He had an eerily good record at doing just that. Her strength and speed and skill she could rely on. Still, it was annoying that there were no spare firearms. On the other hand, it wouldn't be like Tricker to leave anything to chance. It was a pity he was human. Sometimes he seemed more like one of her type. Dieter woke slowly, rising to consciousness through frantic dreams of being pursued. He moved in his sleep, and pain brought him fully aware, causing him to suck in his breath sharply, only to have it cut short by a slash of agony. He choked, then let out the excess air in slow bursts to ease the excruciating pain in his side. The sensation was familiar, but it wasn't one you ever got used to. This time, he didn't seem to be waking up in a hospital either. Always a bad sign. Broken rib, he thought. At least one. Von Rossbach opened his eyes to surprisingly dim light, then realized that he was in some kind of snow cave, which explained why he hadn't frozen solid. In fact, comparatively speaking, he was relatively warm. Snow could be good insulation. At the very least, it stopped the wind. He moved his legs experimentally and found them merely cold and not broken. One of his arms was free, but the other was pinned and numb. Carefully, he lifted his head to take a look. A seal's head and neck pinned him down. The surreal sight brought the circumstance of his fall back to him in a rush. Was that when all these huge blocks of snow had fallen too? He lowered his head and realized that he'd laid it down on something reasonably soft. Turning carefully, he saw that he was also lying on top of a seal. Sandwich, he thought wryly. Blubber made good insulation. Another reason why I'm not a popsicle. John won't know where I am, he suddenly thought. He shoved at the seal's head with his free arm, with about the same results as pushing at a boulder. The whole animal had stiffened into one solid piece. 400 pounds of meat stiffened into rigor mortis could only be shifted by a crane. He raised his head to study the situation and decided to try sliding out from underneath it. Only its head, neck, and part of a shoulder held him pinned. Luckily. Otherwise, he'd never have woken. The weight of the thing on his broken ribs would have smothered him or driven the broken ends of the bones into his lungs. But its slowly cooling body had saved his life. Carefully, he tried to wriggle out from under the huge creature, only to find himself held fast by his trapped right arm. Dieter tried to move. He couldn't feel his arm at all, anywhere below the shoulder. Nevertheless, it did move. He could feel it slide down towards his back by a couple of inches. Not broken, he thought with relief. Not frozen solid either. Just a pinch of the nerve. Blood still circulating. He managed to slide it down until it struck the seal beneath him. Once there, he was stuck again. The flesh of the dead seal on top of him had molded itself around his arm and then hardened, giving him no leeway. The one beneath formed a solid floor that might as well have been oak. Sucking in his breath to make himself smaller was not in the equation at the moment. Interesting problem, he thought. He got his left hand underneath the seal's chin and lifted. A fraction of an inch might be all he needed to get free. But his ribs quickly and loudly protested. He stopped. It had been a faint hope anyway. If all he'd had to do was break its spine, it might have been possible. But getting this thing moved would require breaking its whole body. Even in my younger days, without broken ribs, I doubt I could have done it. He'd been lucky about the ribs. They might be broken, but they hadn't pierced any important organs. He'd better make sure they hadn't. Every muscle in your gut and upper body pulled on the spine and breastbone, and the ribs were what joined those. Dieter beat his left leg and began sliding his booted foot towards his free hand. He reached for the knife in his boot sheath, straining towards it despite the grating protest from his ribs. Definitely more than one, but only on one side. Almost more than the pain, he hated the sensation of wrongness in his body. His fingertips brushed the hilt, but he had to stop and get his breath. Grasping his pant leg to prevent his foot from sliding out of reach, he allowed himself to relax. Not easy to do in this slightly curled posture, where he felt his ribs separate with every painful breath. Realizing that he wasn't going to get any rest until this was finished, he walked his hand back towards his boot, trying to pull his leg closer with every move. Dieter pulled until the tendons in his knee protested, then pulled some more. Finally, he gritted his teeth, then lunged, to be rewarded by possession of the knife's hilt, and a pain so sharp from his side that he almost grayed out. But he held on to both his consciousness and the knife. Closing his eyes, he took a series of long, slow breaths to calm the pain and get himself in the zone. Then he started carving at his prison. After what seemed like an eternity in a freezing white hell, Dieter flung himself up onto the hard surface at the top of the crevasse. Then he pulled himself into fetal position to conserve body heat and rested. "Don't rest too long," he warned himself. Too long being a very short time out here. Wincing, von Rossbach pushed himself into a sitting position. Some of his senses seemed to have shut down. Smell, for example, though that might just be the cold. The world seemed to be very far away, seen through a thick plate of clear glass. At least the blizzard had stopped. If it had still been snowing, things would be even more desperate. He thanked God for great favors. He checked the time and date. Early afternoon. Day after I acted like a complete dummkopf and left the tent alone. He knew better than to do a thing like that, and he'd paid dearly for the mistake. Dieter struggled to his feet, and after a moment's dizziness, felt better for it. Without the weight of a fully grown seal crushing his body, his ribs didn't hurt nearly as much. Looking around, he saw that someone else might have paid for his mistake. There was a mound of bloodied snow near where he'd crawled out of the rift, and following the blood trail with his eyes led him to the imprint of the snowmobile. As he looked over the marks in the snow, he decided that John must have fallen into the crevasse, and that Wendy, clever girl, had used the snowmobile to pull him out. Von Rossbach leaned over the edge cautiously to find another seal. This one broken on the same massive blocks of ice that had sheltered him. Dieter sincerely hoped that the blood belonged to the animal, because there seemed to be quite a lot of it. Turning away, he followed the snowmobile's tracks back to their campsite, and wasn't really surprised to find that John and Wendy were gone. They'd naturally assumed that he was dead, and had continued the mission without him. Which was entirely reasonable, especially given John's training, but not a very welcome discovery. A man on foot and without supplies was at a distinct disadvantage here, even if it was just a short walk to shelter. He looked into the distance. Yes, the rock ridge was unmistakable. Even a storm wouldn't recarve the surface ice that much in so short a time. That's the direction. So I'd better get going before the weather changes again. Traveling on foot was going to be bad enough without risking another sudden storm. Though the sky seemed clear enough now. Perhaps it was his ribs, but he felt pessimistic. With a grimace of distaste, he pulled a chunk of seal blubber out of his pocket, and lifting his balaclava, worried off a piece with strong white teeth. Then he returned the bloody lump to its place. He chewed thoughtfully as he walked. Seal blubber was awful stuff, tasting like fishy lard with a slightly more solid texture. But it was high energy and would keep him going as long as anything that came out of a nutritional lab. Talk about cold comfort. Clea lay on her cot, going over and over the corridors and the labs and the offices of the complex through the eyes of the security cameras, and found herself very close to being bored. Where are the cameras that watch Tricker? She wondered. And those that watched the perimeter of the base, where were they? Every other inch of the base was wired. Why not the sheds? Lab after lab flickered by, and then the deserted offices. But there were omissions in what she was seeing. There were 57 separate labs or offices on view. But the cameras in the base's various corridors showed 60 doors. Missing was some sort of security center, where the monitors would be, and the recording equipment. Perhaps an office or two that needed to remain secret. Although, somewhat to her surprise, she'd located the office of the base commander quite easily. Clea would have expected a slightly higher level of security for such a sensitive area. I'm blind here, she thought impatiently, sitting up. I need to find out what's in those unscanned rooms. That would take a little work, but it would be worth it. She'd discovered earlier in the day that Tricker had locked down the elevator on the top floor, and the only other way to get from one floor to another was the emergency stairs, which were both freezing cold and guarded by alarmed doors. Not even a challenge for such as she. The next time the cameras went off, she flashed down the corridor at her top speed and disabled the emergency door's alarm. Then she raced to the next level and disarmed the alarm on that level too. With less than 15 seconds left, she reached the first mystery door, only to find it locked. She moved on to the second, also locked. When the security cameras came back on, she had stuffed herself into a narrow supply closet in someone's office. A minute could pass quite slowly under those circumstances, and she had to force herself to remain still. She couldn't help thinking that it was extremely likely that Tricker was asleep, making it safe for her to roam around. After all, he was only human. He had to sleep sometime. For that matter, so did she. And yet it would be foolish to jeopardize the mission on that assumption, because, being Tricker, he might also be looking right at her. And so she waited. When the cameras went off again, she was instantly in the corridor working on the lock. It was a good one, but not as complex as she had feared, and she was soon slipping inside. 2 of the 3 doors she'd marked led to a single large room with banks of monitors on the longest wall. Around the other sides of the room were ranks of recording equipment, file cabinets, and a number of desks. Clea quickly ascertained that this was the room that monitored the bulk of the facility. The 3rd room would be the one that she wanted. When she pulled the door closed, the room locked behind her, to her great relief. No need to fiddle with the lock again. She flung herself back into her closet just in time. It was inconvenient that she had to skulk around like this, but she wasn't quite ready to dispose of Tricker yet. Or perhaps it was that she had come to agree with Serena about him. He was more of a challenge than the average human. Then again, having him around was a complicating factor for Connor and his party. A quick check of her computer component said it skewed the odds in her favor. Marginally, but it was time again. The 3rd door yielded readily to her lockpicks, and she found herself in a room the size of a small office. There were only 10 monitors here, 2 for the security rooms, 6 for the sheds up above, and 2 to scan the perimeter. Clearly, the powers that be didn't think that was much of a priority. The I-950 quickly made the connections that would tie these monitors into the base's main security system, and thus into the Skynet computer, and through that, to her. She went into hiding one more time and studied the new images. First, she noted that Tricker was indeed awake and was watching the security cameras flick from place to place. Then she saw that the base was experiencing whiteout conditions again. Or was still. She had no way to be sure. The cameras went down, and she rushed back to her lab and lay on her cot. It would be good to know where Tricker was at any given moment. Though it frustrated her to know that if John Connor was coming, he'd be delayed by the weather. John gently shook Wendy awake. She opened her eyes and blinked at him. "Was I asleep?" she asked. "Most definitely," he whispered. He grinned and then brought it down a few notches with a wince as the stitches tugged at the tears in his face. "You've got a cute little snore." "I don't snore," she said indignantly. He put his fingers across her lips, then kissed her. "A very ladylike little snore." Wendy buried her face in his shoulder with a giggle, then sighed. "It's time, isn't it?" He nodded silently. "What do we do?" she asked. We're still locked in, right? We do one of two things. We break out of here and try to get the drop on him, or we lure him here and try to get the drop on him. Either way comes down to the same thing. I wish we could have brought weapons, he thought fervently. A weapon would be real nice now. But that would have blown their cover story for good and all. Then let's lure him here. We'll get the drop on him after I've had a chance to go to the bathroom, she said practically. Good point, he agreed. A moment later, Wendy was knocking quietly on the door and calling out. What is it? Tricker asked. I need to go to the bathroom, Wendy whispered. He unlocked the door and opened it to find the sleep-tousled girl frowning at him. How come you locked us in? She asked. Sorry, he said. Regulations. Regulations, she said, as though beginning a tirade. Bathroom's the last door on the right. He stood there, bland-faced, as though nothing unusual was going on. Wendy glared at him for a moment, then flounced off, slamming the bathroom door behind her. Hey, John said, sitting up. Can I have some water? Maybe a couple more aspirin? My head is killing me. Sure, Tricker said. How did that happen? He made no move towards the front office, but watched John approach. Fell, John said. A couple of times. First time, I got the lump. Then I got up and I fell right down again onto some sharp ice. You're lucky you didn't lose an eye, Tricker said. John shuddered. Tell me about it. He looked at the agent and tipped his head towards the office. Could we... Sure, Tricker said with a glance at the closed bathroom door. After you. Clear's eyes widened. They were here. They had come, and she hadn't known. Didn't Tricker realize who they were? How could he miss it? But the agent was relying on a padlock to keep John Connor contained. And that indicated that he didn't know who they were. The I-950 considered the situation. The girl was negligible, no threat at all. But she could be the key to getting Connor right where she wanted him. Therefore, she needed to get control of the girl. On the same wall as the bathroom, towards the front room that held the office, was the door that led down to the elevator. It was locked, but Clea knew the code. She'd noted it when she first arrived. Accessing the security room, she found the remote for the door and tripped the lock. Through the security system and its camera, She watched it swing open about a foot. As the I-950 watched, Connor accepted some tablets from Tricker and a cup of water. Unwisely, in her opinion. She'd want a chemical analysis on anything medicinal that Tricker handed to her. Wendy left the bathroom and started down the hallway. She then exhibited a curious trait that Clea had noticed again and again in human beings. She looked at the open door. Wendy stood stock still, glanced towards the front office, then leaned towards the door. She gently pushed it open just a bit farther and peeked inside. "Hey!" Tricker shouted. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He rushed towards her and yanked the door closed. "How did you get that open?" Surprised, Wendy took a step back. I was just curious," she said. "This door is always locked," he said. "How did you get it open?" It was like that," she squeaked, holding her hands up as though she thought he might hit her. John ghosted up behind him. Then, to Clea's intense annoyance, the cameras cut out. "Shit," she said aloud. She should have taken care of that. "I didn't do anything," Wendy shouted, backing away. "I didn't touch anything. Why are you being like this? What's wrong with you?" Her voice turned whiny. "I didn't do anything!" Tricker spun around just in time to block John's strike and easily reached through John's defense to strike him hard on the jagged cuts on his face. John staggered back, blinded by tears, as the stitches broke and blood began to flow. Wendy squeaked in horror and rushed forward shouting, "Stop it!" Without really looking, Tricker kicked her in the stomach, sending the girl flying backward. She landed, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. Something happened within John at that moment. He became the calm center of the storm, just as his sensei had told him he would. John judged that their skills were about equal, especially with the asset of his youth, even compromised by his wounds. But before the advantage had been all Tricker's, for his experience, for his ruthlessness. Now they were considerably more equal. John was hyper-aware of everything around him, of Wendy writhing on the floor, trying to get her breath. Tricker flicked a series of kicks at him, low, middle, high, balancing effortlessly. There was no room to dodge. John backed a little, blocking with his forearms and sliding in with his weight on his back foot. "Iss!" he shouted, driving bladed palms at his opponent's groin and eyes. Those eyes widened as Tricker slid back in turn, blocking high and low and trying to capture a wrist. That nearly cost him a kneecap, as John snap-kicked in the moment they were in contact. What followed in the next 30 seconds was like a savage, precisely choreographed dance. One that left John's face wound bleeding again, and Tricker favoring one leg. The younger man waited, hands up and weight centered. It wouldn't last much longer. It couldn't, not when experts were fighting for keeps. The least little advantage. After what seemed to her to be an eternity, Wendy got her breath back and struggled onto her hands and knees to watch the two men battle. "Are you crazy?" Wendy shouted at Tricker, still gasping. "Are you completely insane?" she demanded, tears streaming down her face. The question and her expression were so convincing that for a split second Tricker thought that he might have made a mistake. John's booted foot caught Tricker in the side of the head, and the agent went down, temporarily paralyzed by the blow. Instantly, John followed up with a carotid hold, and Tricker's world went black. John looked at the unconscious man, reached down to check his pulse, then went to Wendy. "You okay?" he asked, deeply concerned. "I've been kicked in the stomach by an expert," she snapped. "So no, I'm not okay. But I'll live," she added grudgingly. She took his offered hand and let him help her to her feet. Then she got a good look at his wounds. "Oh God, John! Your face!" She reached for him, but he held her off. "No time," he said. "We've got to get this guy tied up. Help me look for something." The first thing that John noticed was that the computer screen was flipping through views of rooms a great deal snazzier than this one. Laboratories, by the look of them. "Hey, check it out," he called to Wendy. She stood by his side for a moment, watching, then shook her head. "So, how do we get there?" Then she looked at him and smiled. "That door!" He nodded, wiping the blood off his chin before it could drip onto the keyboard. "But first things first, all right?" He tipped his head towards Tricker. "See what you can find." It wasn't long before Wendy straightened up with a glad cry. Duct tape. The force that holds the universe together. John had made a happy discovery of his own. A Sig Sauer 9mm that he found under the desk in a quick-release clip. "Most excellent," he murmured, caressing the gun. "Hands tied in front or back?" Wendy asked. "Back, most definitely." John went to stand beside her. "Let's get him onto one of the bunks," he suggested. "I'll take his head, you take his feet." They flung him on the bunk, and John got to work winding the tape tightly around the agent's hands and feet. "That's a little snug," Wendy said, looking worried. "Yeah, but if he gets loose, he's gonna try and kill us." "A good point," she conceded. "Most definitely a good point." He wound the tape around their prisoner and the bed at his neck and hips, binding him to the bunk until the tape ran out. "No gag?" Wendy asked. "No point," John said. "There's nobody to hear him. I'd rather use the tape to make sure he doesn't come after us. Besides, they're risky. Too much chance of his choking to death." She looked startled, but nodded wisely. This wasn't her world. In matters like these, she was best to let John be her guide. They left the room and looked across the short hall at the door that Tricker had pulled closed. It stood open a foot. John's body turned to ice, and he could feel his blood pounding in the cuts on his face and the lump on his head. Then he shook it off. "It's here," he said quietly. "And it knows we're here." Wendy looked at his pale face and bit her lip, knowing who he meant, and taking fright from his obvious apprehension. She knew intrinsically that there was only one thing to do in a situation like this. Pretend it didn't matter. "Ah, you can handle it," she said, giving his arm a little slap. "You handled that guy all right." "He is human." John looked at her and wished her gone with all his heart. As though she knew what he was thinking, Wendy leaned in close and kissed his cheek gently. "You need me," she reminded him firmly. He could see her pride as she said it, and putting his hand behind her head, he drew her close and kissed her. It hurt, but it fed his soul. He leaned back and smiled at her. "I'll go get the gun. Then we'll get started," he said. Wendy smiled and nodded. When he was gone, she gave the door beside her an anxious glance, took a deep breath, and rubbed her aching stomach. Looking across the hall, she could just see Tricker lying on the bunk. So far, she thought. So good. He needs her. Clear thought. Whatever for. She certainly can't fight. And if she wasn't here to back him up, then what was her purpose? It had also surprised her that Connor was unarmed. To the I-950, that was synonymous with unprepared. But from what he'd said, he expected her to be here. This suggested an unreasonable degree of self-confidence. But why? What reason had he to be so confident? He and his mother defeated Serena Burns. Her computer reminded her. They have twice destroyed Skynet. A ripple of unease disturbed her. Then she pushed it away, assuring herself that all of these side issues were unimportant. What was important was that the enemy was here, and that she must prepare to deal with him. Separate them, she thought. Maybe leave the girl until later. Connor is the important one. Connor was the first one she would kill. John had made Wendy crouch down and hug the front of the elevator. He stood in front of her, plastered against the wall. When the doors opened, it would appear from the outside that the elevator was empty. He waited until the doors closed by themselves, then waited some more. Wendy stirred, and he put his hand down to warn her to stillness. In the security room, the I-950 watched, both amused and impressed. She assumed that he was counting to some high number and wouldn't move until he'd reached it. Good tactic if you were dealing with a human. Finally, John hit the door button and did a forward roll into the hallway, coming up on one knee, his gun pointing down the empty corridor. His heart was beating so hard that he thought he could see the gun in his hands bob to its rhythm. "Get it under control, John," he warned himself. Get it under control, or he'd be useless when the time came to face the Terminator. He signaled Wendy to come out of the elevator, then gestured to her to stay behind him and keep low. When they got to the first door, he made her stop several paces short of it, then moved up himself. He listened, then flung the door open with a crash, pulling back out of the line of fire. He reached around the doorframe and found the light switch. When the lights came on, he swung back to one knee in the doorway, gun at the ready, then carefully stood and gave the room a quick search. Then he moved on to the next. "Hey," Wendy whispered. "Shouldn't we?" John hissed her to silence, and with a gesture that told her to stay right where she was. Wendy rolled her eyes, but obeyed. She glanced at the elevator. They probably ought to lock it down. But oh well. John knew what he was doing. In her lair in the security room, Clea was silently agreeing with her. John Connor was doing everything right. And he was taking a damn long time doing it too. "I'm glad the lab is only halfway down the corridor. Otherwise, he'll be here until the generator runs out of fuel." And she wanted to know, with a very human curiosity, what the girl was for. At last, John came to a door marked K. Weimeister, the name of the man who'd taken over the Cyberdyne project. This could be it, he warned himself. If the Terminator was anywhere in the facility, this was the logical place. He took a deep breath and flung the door open, and himself into the brightly lit room. He peeked over a counter and looked around. Clea laughed out loud at his expression. She looked forward to showing Alyssa the recording. Even her too solemn little sister would find this funny. She watched him check every inch of the room with exquisite care. It was obvious to her that he placed the safety of his companion above his own. Interesting and possibly useful. John came to the door and gestured Wendy in. "Okay, sweetie, I'm gonna finish checking the other labs. You do your thing. Lock the door after me and don't open it until I can answer a personal question about us." "A personal question? You mean like—" He quickly put a finger across her lips. "Something only you and I would know," he said sternly. "They can imitate anyone's voice. I've heard them." She nodded, wide-eyed. "Okay, I'll think of something." "You do that." He pulled her to him and kissed her, caressed her hair, and turned to the door. "Remember, lock this," he said over his shoulder. I will," she said, smiling. "And get to work." His eyes were already roving up and down the corridor. I will," she repeated, closed the door, locked it, and went to the computer bay. Clea split the feed, watching Connor fruitlessly check the labs while his sweetie got to work. The girl stripped off her bra and slid a pair of micro-diskettes out of a slit in the lining. Not bad, the I-950 thought, amused. She watched, fascinated, as the girl put the disc into its drawer and began to work. The I-950 was reasonably confident that the security protocols they'd installed in the Skynet program could defeat any worm that this child could come up with. Weimeister might be a prick, and he hadn't yet made Skynet intelligent, but he was no slouch in the security department. So this material would be shunted into a buffer where the computer would evaluate it. At first, she was puzzled by what she was reading. Then she sucked in her breath in amazement. This was it. This was the key to Skynet's living intelligence. Why would their worst enemy deliver it to them? And then she understood. They would enumerate every possible path that led to sentience, and then program the machine to ignore any paths or commands leading to that result. Unless the programmers knew those codes were there, they could batter their heads against an impenetrable wall of cross commands for a very long time. Weimeister might figure it out eventually, but probably not before his funding ran out. Or his patience. He wasn't the kind of human who clung to a project that didn't work out. Well, there was the Nazi thing, but he was really involved with that more to annoy people than for any sincere belief. Clea rose from her chair. The girl had brought 2 discs. She had to stop her before she installed whatever was on the second one. Dieter studied the GPS unit, and it told him that he was very close to the second base, possibly within 10 minutes if he could keep up this pace. Good, he thought, because he suspected he was getting a nice little case of frostnip on his toes and face, He'd turned the balaclava around and made tiny holes on the solid back surface in hopes of protecting his eyes from snow blindness. And now that the wind had turned, he hoped it would keep them from freezing altogether. It felt like his lungs were raw right to the bottom, not that he could breathe that deeply. He held his arms tight around himself to keep his ribs as still as possible, which wasn't very, and tried to ignore the pain. He had so many pains to choose from by now that it was almost easy. There was a copper penny taste in the back of his throat, as though he was bleeding, and he was very thirsty. Ice kept forming on the wool around his mouth and nose, making his lips sore and increasing the likelihood of frostbite. All in all, not one of my better days. He slogged on as quickly as he could push himself. When the first of the base's sheds came into view, he said a heartfelt, "Thank God," and hurried towards it. It was small on closer examination, obviously a storage shed, but by then he could see a larger building looming up, and headed for it. Off to his right, a moving shape came towards him, and he paused, thinking it must be someone from the base. It was almost upon him before he could make out what it was. Oh no, not another fucking seal! The creature barked and stretched its neck out at him, teeth bared. With all the strength that frustration, desperation, and outrage could lend a man, von Rossbach hauled off and belted the exhausted animal. It made a small sound and collapsed at his feet, rolling onto its back with flippers extended in a limp V-shape. Dieter swayed in the wind, looking down at it for a moment, not quite believing it had been that easy. It stayed down. "Good," he said with a satisfied nod, and headed for the largest shed. Burns. Tricker thought. Must save Burns. No, not Burns, Bennett. Bennett was the asset. Burns was an asset to Cyberdyne, and she had assets. She'd tried to use those assets to vamp him. But she didn't try very hard. He thought regretfully. He frowned. Bennett, not Burns. I have to save Bennett. Bennett wasn't Burns. But she might be. Two peas in a pod. He blinked and shook his head, regretting it instantly as it rang like a carillon. Shit, he said aloud. He tried to move and found himself well and truly bound. Shit, he said again, with much more resignation. What had he been thinking about? Oh yes, Burns and Bennett, and how much alike they looked. The two women might be identical twins. What were the odds of that? Two unrelated people looking exactly alike, except for hair color, which could easily be handled by Lady Clairol. And what the hell did it matter? He had to get out of here and down to the labs, where the action was. Tricker started to pull his belt around. One edge of the buckle was extremely sharp, something that came in handy for times like these. Then he heard the outside door open and slam shut. The shed door was unlocked, and Dieter entered, slammed it behind him, and slid down its surface to rest on the floor. To him, the room was pitch dark. Didn't escape the snow blindness entirely, he thought, disappointed. But at least he wasn't going to freeze. He pushed back his hood and yanked the soaking balaclava from his head. Next time, he was going to get one of those fleece ones. Better yet, he thought. Next time, there's not going to be a next time. He knew now, right down in his bones, how close he'd come to dying out there. If the wind had been just a little worse. "Hey!" a voice called from another room. "Who's out there?" With a mental sigh, Dieter got himself to his feet, then cautiously moved farther into the room. "Hello," he said. "Who is that?" the voice called. "Weihmeister?" "I can't see," Dieter said as he bumped into what felt like an office chair. He took hold of it and pushed it in front of him like a bulky white cane. "I've got a touch of snow blindness. Keep talking and I'll find you." "Over here," Tricker called. "There's a hallway. I'm in the first room on your left. This way." Dieter found the wall and followed it, still pushing the chair until his hand fell through an opening. "It's pitch dark for me," he said. "Are the lights on at all?" "No. There's a switch on the right of the door, about 4 inches from the frame." Von Rossbach found the switch easily and flicked it on. To him, the light was dim, but he could easily make out a man tied up on a bunk. "Ah, I see my young friends have already been here," he said with a smile. "You must be the guide they mentioned," Tricker said sourly. "Did they try to kill you too?" "Did they try to kill you?" Dieter asked, surprised. He unzipped the parka and began to shrug out of it. Tricker thought about it. "No, I guess not." He lifted his bound hands significantly. "Are you gonna help me out of here?" "No," Dieter said, and turned around, peering into the dark of the hallway. "No," Tricker said. "Why not?" "They're just a couple of crazy kids," Von Rossbach explained. "There's no real harm in them. I'll round them up and get them out of your way. The thing is, if they've tied you up, they must have had a reason. Until I find out what that is, it might not be safe to let you go, eh?" Buddy, this is a US government scientific installation. I demand that you let me go. Dieter looked at him. Are you the only one here? He asked mildly. Tricker hesitated. At the moment, yeah. You might have a touch of cabin fever then. It may be that you attacked my young friends. Where are they, anyway? Is there another large building on this base? I didn't see one. Tricker tightened his lips and put his head back down on the pillow. Maybe they ran off into the storm, he muttered. And left you like this? I hardly think they'd be so irresponsible. They left you, didn't they? Tricker said precisely. A different situation altogether, Dieter assured him. His eyes were beginning to adjust and he could see things, finally. Like the roll of duct tape on a shelf and the open door on the other side of the hall. He picked up the duct tape and began to wind it tightly around his torso, feeling immediate relief. He cut it off with the knife he'd found on the shelf. It was John's. He decided to keep it. I'll just have to look around for them, shall I? Like you'd stay put if I told you to, Tricker muttered. Surely you want me to find them, von Rossbach said cheerfully. Even his face wasn't feeling so bad now. Maybe he'd escaped frostbite after all. Oh, surely, Tricker muttered as he heard the man clatter down the stairs and then heard the elevator begin to work. Don't call me Shirley, he thought woozily. He'd only been awake for maybe a minute when he heard the man come in. Then, when he'd heard that slight accent, he'd thought, crazily, that it might be Weimeister coming after Bennett. That kid must have hit me pretty hard, he thought. Hell, if I'm imagining that Superkraut would risk his precious ass in an Antarctic blizzard for a woman who has publicly rejected him, then I might actually have brain damage. But then, this place seemed to be turning into Grand fucking Central Station. So who knew who was going to turn up next? He got to work pulling his belt around so that he could use the buckle to get him out of this mess. This definitely wasn't one of his most shining moments, he complained to himself. On the downside, it was 3-1 and the kid had his gun. But on the upside, that wasn't his only gun.